Okay, word for word. Tasmat Sarva Atmana Rajan Hari Sarvatra Sarvada Shrotavya Kirtitavya Cha Smartavya Bhagavan Nrinam Tasmat Sarvatmana Rajan Hari Sarvatra Sarvada Shrotavya Kirtitavyascha Smartavyo Bhagavan Nrinam Tasmat Sarvatmana Rajan Hari Sarvatra Sarvada Shrotavya Kirtitavyascha Smartavyo Bhagavan Nrinam Tasmat Sarvatmana Rajan Hari Sarvatra Sarvada Shrotavya Kirtitavyascha Smartavyo Bhagavan Nrinam
Tasmat Sarvatmana Rajan Hari Sarvatra Sarvada Shrotavya Kirtitavyascha Smartavyo Bhagavan Nrinam
Tasmat Sarvatmana Rajan Hari Sarvatra Sarvada Shrotavya Kirtitavyascha Smartavyo Bhagavan Nrinam
Tasmat Sarvatmana Rajan Hari Sarvatra Sarvada Shrotavya Kirtitavyascha Smartavyo Bhagavan Nrinam
Tasmat Sarvatmana Rajan Hari Sarvatra Sarvada Shrotavya Kirtitavyascha Smartavyo Bhagavan Nrinam
Tasmat Sarvatmana Rajan Hari Sarvatra Sarvada Shrotavya Kirtitavyascha Smartavya Bhagavan Nrinam
Tasmat Sarvatmana Rajan Hari Sarvatra Sarvada Shrotavya Kirtitavyascha
Shrotavya Kirtitavyascha
Smartavyo Bhagavan Nrinam
Smartavyo Bhagavan Nrinam Nrinam
Tasmat Sarvatmana Rajan
Tasmat Sarvatmana Rajan
Hari Sarvatra Sarvada
Hari Sarvatra Sarvada
Shrotavya Kirtitavyascha
Shrotavya Kirtitavyascha
Smartavyo Bhagavan Rinam
Smartavyo Bhagavanrinam
Tasmat Sarvatmana Rajan
Tasmat Sarvatmana Rajan
Hari Sarvatra Sarvada
Hari Sarvatra Sarvada
Shrotavya Kirtitavyascha
Shrotavya Kirtitavyascha
Smartavyo Bhagavan
Smartavyo Bhagavanrinam Tasmat, therefore, Sarva, all, Atmana, soul, Rajan, O King, Hari, the Lord, Sarvatra, everywhere, Sarvada, always, Shrotavya, must be heard, Kirtitavya, glorified, Cha, also, Smartavya, be remembered, Bhagavan, the personality of Godhead, Nrinam, by the human being. Translation and purport by His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada, Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai. O King, it is therefore essential that every human being hear about, glorify, and remember the Supreme Lord, the personality of Godhead, always and everywhere. Report. Srila Shukadev Goswami begins this verse with the word tasmat, or therefore, because in the previous verse he has already explained that there is no auspicious means for salvation other than the sublime process of bhakti yoga. The bhakti yoga process is practiced by the devotees in different methods like hearing, chanting, remembering, serving the lotus feet of the Lord, worshipping, praying, rendering service in love, becoming friendly, and offering all that one may possess. All 9 methods are bona fide methods, and either all of them, some of them, or even one of them can bring about the desired result for the sincere devotee. But out of all the 9 different methods, the first one, namely hearing, is the most important function in the process of bhakti yoga. Without hearing sufficiently and properly, no one can make any progress by any of the methods of practice. And for hearing only, all the Vedic literatures are there, compiled by authorized persons like Vyasadeva, who is the powerful incarnation of Godhead. And since it has been ascertained that the Lord is the supersoul of everything, he should therefore be heard and glorified everywhere and always. That is the special duty of the human being. When the human being gives up the process of hearing about the all-pervading personality of Godhead, he becomes victim to hearing rubbish transmitted by man-made machines. Machinery is not bad because through the machine one can take advantage of hearing about the Lord. But because machinery is used for ulterior purposes, it is creating rapid degradation in the standard of human civilization. It is said here that it is incumbent upon the human being to hear because the scriptures like Bhagavad Gita and Srimad Bhagavatam are made for that purpose. Living beings other than human beings have no ability to hear such Vedic literatures. If human society gives itself to the process of hearing the Vedic literature, it will not become a victim to the impious sounds vibrated by impious men who degrade the standards of the total society. Hearing is solidified by the process of chanting. One who has perfectly heard from the perfect source becomes convinced about the all-pervading personality of Godhead, and thus becomes enthusiastic in glorifying the Lord. All the great acharyas like Ramanuja, Madhva, Chaitanya, Sarasvati Thakur, or even in other countries, Muhammad, Christ, and others, have all extensively glorified the Lord by chanting always and in every place. Because the Lord is all-pervading, it is essential to glorify Him always and everywhere. In the process of glorifying the Lord, there should be no restriction of time and space. This is called Sanatana Dharma or Bhagavat Dharma. Sanatan means eternal, always and everywhere. Bhagavat means pertaining to Bhagavan, the Lord. The Lord is the master of all time and all space, and therefore the Lord's holy name must be heard, glorified, and remembered everywhere in the world. That will bring about the desired peace and prosperity so eagerly awaited by the people of the world. The word cha includes all the remaining processes or methods of bhakti yoga, as mentioned above. Translation: O King, it is therefore essential that every human being hear about, glorify, and remember the Supreme Lord, the personality of Godhead, always and everywhere. Maharaj, would you like to comment or speak? So I was thinking about this. There was a point that Srila Prabhupada made that I thought was really nice, where he said that if the civilization takes to hearing the Vedic literature, then they will not become victim of the impious sounds vibrated by impious men who degrade the standards of the total society. So I was reflecting on this because, as everybody knows, I spent recent time in Vrindavan, and everywhere you go, you hear Hare Krishna. You almost get run over by a rickshaw and everybody's just chanting, Radhe, Radhe. Somebody's trying to sell you fruit. Haribo, Haribo. So everything is some way revolving around Krishna. Everybody's Krishna conscious in some way. But here, we have firsthand experience. You come to the temple, you're hearing the Srimad Bhagavatam, you're trying to remember the Lord, you're trying to chant his holy names, but then sometimes as soon as you walk up the temple, you hear all these impious sounds, whether it be through people talking or through speakers or other means. These impious sounds, they're polluting our consciousness. So, being in Vrindavan or the Holy Dham for such a period of time, there's not so much of this at all. So whatever's polluting your consciousness is in your consciousness, these anarthas and things that we carry with us, because everywhere you're surrounded by devotion. Everywhere you go in some way or form. Everywhere you go, it might not be an ISKCON temple like you're used to seeing and everything orderly, but there's temples everywhere. There's people chanting the holy names everywhere. People are coming so far to see Krishna in all his different wonderful forms. But here, we don't have that. So we have to rapidly hear. We have to hear attentively. I remember one time we were listening to a class from Radhe Shyam Prabhu, and he was mentioning that, in India, the devotees, they could and should put more of a focus on hearing of Krishna, these sweet leelas, these pastimes, and really get absorbed that way. But he was making the point that in the West, we need to really hear the philosophy of the basic philosophy that we're not our body, that our senses are pulling us on a run, and this creates all sorts of distress. And then if we hear the philosophy constantly, then we can combat that, like this point that Srila Prabhupada was making here. So I thought that was a nice point. But this series of shlokas that we've been reading has been really pounding in this point that you need to hear constantly, starting with talking about Brahma, who studied the Vedas 3 times and scrutinizingly studying them. And he gave his heart to the Supreme Lord. And then the shloka we read yesterday was also really nice. The personality of Godhead, Lord Sri Krishna, is in every living being along with the individual soul. And this fact is perceived and hypothesized in our acts of seeing and taking help from the intelligence. So when we hear the Vedic literature and we absorb our mind in this philosophy, then it purifies our intelligence so we can come to the platform of seeing the Lord everywhere. The Kanishta Adhikari, he comes to the temple, and this isn't just something we can read. We can observe this, and we should observe this. We could see certain persons come to the temple maybe once a week, and they come and they put all their attention to the deities for the arati. But when it comes to associating with or hearing from the devotees, there might not be so much attention or of the same respect. So this is the Kanishta Adhikari. He thinks, here's God, here's me. Boss, this is it. But then the Madhyama Adhikari, he can make a distinction between the different levels, where he has a vision of the Lord, he has a vision of the devotees, he has a vision of those who are favorable or ignorant, and he has a vision of those who are atheistic, those who are antagonistic towards devotional service. And the Uttama Adhikari, on the ultimate platform, he sees everybody as a servant of the Lord. So this second canto of the Srimad Bhagavatam, it's beginning with Shukadeva Goswami replying to Maharaj Parikshit's questions from the end of the first canto. And if you read it, it really echoes the beginning of the Srimad Bhagavatam, where Suta Goswami is answering the 6 questions of the sages assembled at Naimisharanya. And this is because Sukadeva Goswami, it's because the Srimad Bhagavatam is being passed down through the parampara. So one hears and his intelligence becomes purified, and he can begin to see the Lord in all persons and all of his dealings and all of activities and the nature around him. And in this way, his intelligence will be purified and he'll develop his own realizations. So we can take the points that we hear and propound upon them and elaborate on them and learn to speak them in a way that is palatable for those around us in the present time, place, and circumstance, so that they can easily ascertain this sublime message that's spoken to awaken our dormant love of God. We never change the philosophy at all. We speak it as it is, but at the same time, you can present it in certain ways that might be easy for others to connect with it. So Shukadeva Goswami, he's speaking to Maharaj Parikshit, and he's answering these questions, and then he begins giving him the vision of the Virat Rupa, the universal form of the Lord. Do you remember reading this, Jagannath? You read this, right? He's giving all these examples of the Lord, like I forget them all. I was reading it a little bit yesterday. His artistic ability is the birds, things like his hair is the grass, his mountains are the bones, or I don't know the exact details because there's a few different descriptions of these, and they're slightly different, but they're the same. It's the idea is to give somebody who has this materialistic mind the vision so which they can meditate on the Lord, and in this way it will awaken their attraction for the Lord. So this was the first chapter of the second canto. And the second chapter, Shukadeva Goswami, he begins describing the process that one can meditate on the Supersoul and become connected to the Paramatma in all walks of life at all times. And in this way, then he can give up his material body, which we were reading last week. He was saying one can... The devotee, thus surpassing the gross and subtle forms of coverings, enters the plane of egoism, and in that state he merges into the material modes of nature, and in this point of neutralization, and thus reaches egoism and goodness. After all, this egoism is merged in the Mahatattva. Then he comes to the point of pure self-realization. So it's describing how one sheds all these material coverings that we have, and coming in contact with the true ego, true self-realization, which is Krishna Nityadasa, eternal servant of the Lord. And then at the end of this chapter, Sukadeva Goswami, he's really making the point that knowing the Supreme Personality of Godhead is all in all. And the best way to do that is to hear about him, to glorify him, and not just once, but always. And Srila Prabhupada was really making it known in this purport that should not be limited to time or place, meaning that whatever time, whatever place we are in, we should learn to worship and serve the Lord accordingly. Shri Shri Gordon Tai Ki Jai. Whatever country we also may be in. I had the good fortune recently, I met so many devotees from so many different parts of the globe, so many different languages. Some devotees speaking Russian and Spanish and Slovenian and Dutch and Swahili, Hindi, Bengal, all these different languages. So everybody is, what I mean to say is, it's so nice because you can go visit any of these ISKCON temples in any of these countries, and naturally you have a connection with all the devotees because our life is revolving around the service and glorification of the Lord. There might be cultural barriers or language barriers, but that's the essence. And Srila Prabhupada, in this light, he said that ISKCON is the real United Nations because there's something that everybody can bond around. It's spiritual communism. You put the Supreme Lord in the middle and everybody revolves around this, and in this way everybody will become happy. Krishna, he says in the Bhagavad Gita, he said, Bhoktaram yagatapasam sarva loka maheshwaram sardadam sarva bhutanam gyatva mam shantim richati. He says, just give everything to me. Do all your sacrifices for me. Bhoktaram yagatapasam. Do your austerities and sacrifices as an offering to me. And in this way, everybody will become peaceful in all the world. Sarva loka maheshwaram. Because Krishna is the controller. So if we're pleasing the controller, then naturally everybody else will be pleased. And I really like this example that's given of a pond, where imagine we're all sitting around a pond and we're throwing our little pebbles in this pond and it creates ripples. And these pebbles, they exemplify our actions, our desires, our motivations. And before devotional service, everybody's throwing all sorts of crazy pebbles all over the place. I want to get this job. I want to get this money. I want to, be like this. I want to learn this hobby. I want to conquer the world. I want to travel here. All these different things. And there's always a conflict of interest. So how can we expect peace in the world if there's no common interest that connects us all? Because Srila Prabhupada here, he was mentioning that humans have the ability to hear, whereas animals, they do not have this ability. And I remember one time an example at the temple in Vrindavan, they have like a big fence over top the opening. It's open, like a courtyard. And they have that so no monkeys get in there or other animals. But there's always pigeons. The pigeons, I don't know why, they always find a way to get into the temple. So they're always living in there. And sometimes they pass stool and do other things. And I remember hearing one time where the devotees were talking about it back when Srila Prabhupada was here. And the devotees were like, oh, look how nice. The pigeons, they came to hear the Srimad Bhagavatam. Prabhupada said, no, they don't hear. They just come and they have sex all the time. So this is the nature of animals, that they could hear a sound, but they can't disseminate what's actually being spoken. Whereas a human, we can hear, and immediately, as long as you understand the language, it penetrates your consciousness so deeply. But even if you don't understand the language, this transcendental sound has an effect. But by hearing it spoken and being able to meditate on the points, it becomes clear what life's goal is. And in this way, we can all have a commonality so that we can act in a way that will bring peace. Otherwise, everybody's just completely speculating and they're running around like animals. Like, what are the animals doing? The squirrel's running around trying to get his nuts. The birds running around trying to get his seeds. All these animals are running around with their own agendas. So similarly, without this Vedic literature and worship of the Supreme Lord, we're all just running around like animals with crazy agendas that are not in congruence with reality. And then people wonder why there's so much problems in the world: depression, suffering, anxiety, obesity, all these problems. And America, which most of the world pursues to follow in one way or another, is like the home of all these issues, because there's this godless government ruling things that's propagating this idea of uncontrolled just sense gratification. And it's propagated under the name of freedom. So many countries in the world, they face so much oppression from dictators or famine or, environmental factors. And a big reason why they look up to America is this freedom. So Prabhupada said that America is good because it has this freedom. So it allows people to hear different messages and hear our preaching and, really venture into their way of life, which could bring them to hearing the Bhagavad Gita or hearing from devotees. But in another way, this freedom is complete illusory, because people don't understand what actual freedom is. You have no idea. How can we be free when we're controlled by so many vices, so many different things? I mean, we went out to do Harinam on Saturday, and like I mentioned, I was in Vrindavan for the past 6 months. So just being there for a few minutes, I was like, wow, I don't know how people live here. There's just uncontrolled attacking at your senses. Everywhere you look, there's meat being cooked. There's people wearing hardly any clothes at all. I mean, not just wearing no clothes, but dressing in super provocative ways. The whole society is just built around lust. And this lust, all it is, it's a distraction from the reality that suffering is there. We're chasing lust, trying to enjoy for the time being, but inevitably suffering is there. And this point is not even really so hard to realize. It's really not, but we ignore it. I mean, before devotional service, I'm sure everybody had their own instances where you're trying to do something. You're working hard to develop a new skill or better your life in some way. Or maybe you feel stagnant and you want some kind of change. And then you find something, but it's always temporary. It only lasts for so long before you're back in the same cycle again of, oh, I need to make this change. Oh, I need to get back on track where I was, a few years ago. I remember one time hearing a lecture by Devamrita Swami, and he was making the point that karmis, most people, he was just giving the example that some people, they'll go out to have coffee, to meet with friends, or have lunch and meeting with friends, and they'll sit around and talk. And essentially they're talking about, oh, you remember that one time 10 years ago when I was happy? A time 5 years ago when I actually was happy. So similarly, we all do the same thing. A lot of us are younger, so we might not have that thing of, looking back that long ago of that time when we were happy. But we all have this thing of, oh, I remember that time when, I was really enthusiastic, when I was really happy, when, life was going good, when everything was all lining up. Let me get back there. And, this is the illusion of the material world, that we think that we're going to get some happiness because we got some happiness before, but it was temporary. And then we're always trying to find that again, but it's never there. It's always fleeting. And this is chewing of the chewed. We're taking something that was chewed, something that's been tried and done over and over again, and we're trying to change it up in this way and change it in this way. So this way we can derive new pleasure, which it's not wrong in one sense. It's just the focus is misdirected, because the spiritual world is full of all variegatedness, and this material world is just a reflection of the material world or the spiritual world. So whatever's here is there. So we're chasing this variegated pleasure here, but it's not to be found. But as soon as we direct that towards the source of all varieties, who is the Supreme Personality of Godhead, the Absolute Truth, then immediately we can relish this nectar. And I was reading ahead of this chapter we're on, and the last shloka really capitalizes on that same point, that we should relish these pastimes of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Relish them. I mean, we can really hear about them for our whole life, and that's nice. I mean, what else can you hear about that you hear over and over and over that you don't get sick of? You just want to. But the more you hear about Krishna, the more sweetness develops, the more attraction develops, the more purification of heart develops. And the great thing is that, we can try this, we can experiment with this. I thought I was actually going to speak on this the last verse, but I just wanted to mention, I read something from the purport, which we'll hear tomorrow, is that Shri Guru Nitai Ki Jai. It's a really nice point. It says, thus by the process of bhakti yoga directly accepted as suggested in this verse by sufficient hearing of the transcendental message of the Lord, the material contamination is directly eliminated within one's attempt to contemplate the impersonal Virat conception of the Lord. And by practicing bhakti yoga, if the performer is not purified from the material contamination, he must be a pseudo-devotee. For such an impostor, there is no remedy for being freed from the material entanglement. So this is a really nice point. It says that if by practicing bhakti yoga, the performer is not purified from our material contaminations, we must be a pseudo-devotee because we're not doing something right. So I was reading in Madhurya Kadambini by Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur, and he's, for those unfamiliar with the book, he's talking about the process of bhakti, where bhakti comes from, and then how bhakti develops within the being from Shraddha to Prem. And then from Shraddha to Prem, he breaks down each portion of that, and he reveals different anarthas or different aspects that are blocking us on our path. And he was talking about aparads. He was talking about 4 anarthas, and one being aparad. And he was saying that this aparad specifically is meaning nam aparad. Because if I'm performing aparad while in my services or dealings, with my deity worship or coming to the temple, then by constant chanting and hearing of the holy name and doing constant service, then we'll become purified of these aparads. But if we think that, okay, I can do these offenses in the temple and then I'll chant the holy names and I'll be okay, then this immediately becomes nam aparad. So he was saying, for those who are consciously committing offenses, meaning that I know I'm doing devotional service and I know I have offenses, then he was saying we need to take to the different recommended procedures for rectifying these various offenses. But if one is unconsciously committing offenses, then he can go on for many, many, many years and perform devotional service, and he doesn't even know that he's committing offenses. So he says the way to realize this is that if you're performing devotional service and you're not becoming purified of, these material contaminations like Prabhupada's pointing out here, then clearly you're committing offenses. And he says the way to rectify this is to constantly chant the holy names. So these shlokas here are really calling to constantly chant and hear and glorify the Lord. So by connecting all these points, you could see that chanting and hearing is the essence of all purification. We should guard against all aparads, especially Vaishnava aparad. But at the same time, we have to take shelter of the holy name. This is our shelter, especially in this age of Kali Yuga. And it's not just when we're chanting japa. What are we doing when we done chanting japa, we have extra time. Are we hearing more? Are we chanting more? Chanting extra rounds? Chanting doesn't stop at 16 rounds. We just have to do 16 rounds at least. So thank you everybody for patiently hearing. Does anybody have any questions or comments? Yes, Jagannath Prabhu.
So my question is like, when we're chanting and hearing, is it okay to pray to Krishna? Like, please let me hear this properly. And if not, what is the most effective way for hearing?
Well, as I've heard it, when we chant japa, it's a prayer. I mean, Srila Prabhupada said that chanting japa is like a baby calling out for its mother, crying. So picture right now, a baby's crying. You've heard babies cry, right? It's not like a little wee, it's full on crying. They're calling for their mom. That's all they want. So when we're chanting this Maha Mantra, it's like a constant prayer of crying out to Krishna. So Srila Prabhupada said that when we chant, we should just hear. But we should hear in that mood of calling out, like a baby's crying out for its mother. So we're constantly chanting, calling out for Krishna, but we're just hearing the holy names. So another aspect is that, as soon as we pick up our japa bag, our japa beads, it's good to make a sankalpa, like an intention. Like we should be aware of what we're doing. Like when you pick up your japa mala in the morning, what's your thought? Why are you doing this? Why?
I don't have an intention. I guess I'm doing it because I just want to make advancement. That's the main reason why.
So everybody picks it up with a certain intention, whether they're aware or not. And, it may be, I have to do this. I made a vow, I have to do this. I really want to get connected to Krishna. I really want to hear his holy names. I want to do this to please Krishna. So we might have different intentions, and it might be different according to different days. Sometimes we might be really tired or sick, and advancement and hearing Krishna's names is almost out the window. So it's just like, I'm just going to do this because I made a promise that I'm going to do this. But my point is, it's good to be aware of what we're doing in all activities, but especially japa, because we spend so much time doing it. So that's a good time to set a prayer, a little intention. Okay, Krishna, I'd like to make advancement. I'd like to hear your holy names. Please help me focus. And one thing I've heard from Borijan Prabhu, who does many japa seminars and workshops, he'd always say the point of just try to hear one mantra. Sometimes we sit and it's like, okay, I have to hear everything. And then we're sitting and we're focusing so hard trying to hear. And then an hour goes by and it's like, what? I didn't hear anything. But if we just try to hear one mantra, just hear Krishna's name one time, then from that hearing, from my own personal experiences, that from hearing that one time, you get connected. You get like a little tiny taste, and then it entices you to just be patient and then hear more. So then rather trying to get ahead of ourselves that, I have to hear everything, and then we get discouraged because we hear nothing. Well, let me just hear one mantra. So, you could give a whole class on these things you're talking about, but I hope that helps. Is there any other final comments or questions, thoughts, reflections? Okay. Yes, Mogadari Prabhu.
I do have a question about this concept of hearing constantly. Is there a certain type of hearing that's better to do constantly than others. And like some devotees, they always put in a headphone throughout the day, and also maybe even when they take rest. And other devotees, they don't do that. How to understand?
I mean, different devotees have different inclinations. It's good to constantly hear, but also if we're hearing and remembering what we heard, that's good. I know with me, I can say, okay, I'm just going to hear and try to remember everything I heard, but then easily you hear some other kind of sound outside, or your mind trips and gives you some other ideas. So it's easy to become distracted. So if you have headphones and you're hearing all the time, I know a lot of devotees do this. Some don't. Some try to chant all the time. I mean, it's all good. It's what works for us. I mean, I notice, say, if I walk around with headphones all the time, then it usually disconnects me more with the devotees. Because then, devotees see like, oh, he's listening to this, and, it's kind of like a halfway thing. So there's a balance, but each devotee needs to do what he needs to do so he can prosper. We come to the temple to gather together for sadhu sangha so we can help each other, but I can't row your boat. I can't flap your wings. You have to do what works for you. And that works differently for different devotees. We have different natures. But the principle is constant hearing. And, you can connect to that remembering also. Because if we're hearing, the point of hearing is so that we can remember the Lord. Because if we're hearing and we're not remembering the Lord, then what are we? Just like these animals I was talking about. We're just hearing some noise and then it's going out the other ear. So we need to hear and let it seep into our consciousness. And we should do that. We should practice questioning. We should study. Maybe if we come and we hear, or if we read and somebody asks us what we read and we say, oh, I don't know, I spaced out. We should rethink our approach. I know I've heard one devotee, he made the point that when we read, we should read with the consciousness that I'm going to share this with somebody else. So then that goes the same for hearing. So like if I'm hearing or reading, let me do that. And I remember when I was in Vrindavan, somebody asked the question of, I always forget what happens in Bhagavatam class. As soon as I walk out the door and we go to the prasadam, and I forget, how can we remember? And the Mataji, she was saying that somebody told her a good practice was that you remember what you heard in the class and immediately you go tell 3 devotees, or, talk about the points. And this way it really helps us do that. So hearing's not limited also to oneself. It's also very potent when we share with others, inquire from others, reveal our mind, and not just superficially, but, real. Okay, thank you everybody for hearing. Srimad Bhagavatam ki jai, Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Sai Gaur Premanandi Hari Hari Bom. Vanshakapaturu Vishchakripa Sindhubi Eva Chapititanam Pavani Bio Vaishnavi Bio.